Day 18 revolves around the climax. Now, the climax is the name we'll give to chapter 6 most of the time. But if you want to use if you want to use more than 10 chapter, think of the climax as the final piece of angst. The moment where the tension, where the pain of the character is at its highest, before chapter 9 and before your epilogue. So it's the highest point in terms of the rhythm. The climax will allow you to present, to display high level of changes in your character. It will be the moment where your character will evolve the most. And this evolution will be through decision which will be taken in reaction to a level of pain which is now increasing dramatically. And finally, their encounter with the true antagonist of the story. Now, the Menace is not the one engineering all the pain in the character's journey. Because the Menace has a goal. She has a goal. She wishes to reach a certain outcome. She wishes to gather certain resources. And therefore, in order to gather those resources to reach their goal, there will be some decision taken by her. And this decision may have consequences on the people of this world, on the atmosphere of this world, on the environment and location of this world. And these decisions' aftermath may be painful, but it is not the main goal of the Menace. The Menace only inflict pain in her trail. The climax is the moment where the Menace reveals herself. As she reveals herself, she modifies behaviors. She changes the behavior of every other character. Whilst changing their behavior, her goal becomes more apparent, such as the threat when she revealed herself in chapter 3. Now, the interests of the Menace will be more visible, but also her needs and her relationships with the protagonist. In the aftermath, whatever has the Menace done, whichever she's responsible for, and whatever action she's taken during the climax, just before the climax in chapter 4 and 5, and right after the climax in chapter 7 and 8, there should be an impact. There should be an impact on individual characters and on organizations. We have to get back to the responsibility principle for a moment. You realize that every damage which is caused by an antagonist, every damage which is caused by a protagonist, wherever it's intentional or unintentional, again, should have an impact. And these impacts are controlled in this world, are managed in this world by organizations. These organizations should take decision. If your individual characters, if your protagonist, for example, is unable to take a decision, and revealing maybe a new aspect of her personality, if she's unable to take a decision, someone else should take one. And it's why it's critical to have organizations in your world, even small-scale organizations, even regional organizations that are in charge of just one settlement. Because these organizations, after a crisis, and especially after the climax, because after the climax, your world should be shaken. Your world should change dramatically. And there has to be a group of individuals, a group of people which are qualified, which will take a decision, and this decision should be taken regarding their prerogatives. So they have an authority on a specific territory, and they should take a decision for this specific territory. The climax is the place where you want to emphasize the relationship between the threat and the menace. Because you have two main options. If you decide that the threat joins the menace, because the menace has tempted her with great benefits, maybe greater benefits than the protagonist, the threat will now be assimilated to the menace. Not necessarily physically, they can still stay two different physical entities, but there will be part of the same group. They will be allies now. The other way is to allow the threat to disappear. And she can disappear in two ways. The threat can disappear by joining the protagonist, or the threat can disappear because the menace has gotten rid of her. Now, if the menace replaces the threat, because now there is no threat anymore, the menace will have to take her decision quite differently, because she has now lost a potential ally. And she has lost this ally either because she gets rid of this ally, or she has lost this ally to the other side. So there's a big alignment shift here. No, this will affect every character's behavior. Comprise the menace herself. Every character's behavior should change. For example, you could have a character facing the death of another character, which wasn't able to help this character before she died, which is quite a classical schema. Now this character will have to reconsider why she lacked strength, or why her weakness that she bears till the beginning of the story has now created this outcome, or facilitated this outcome. Your characters, whichever character it is, again, maybe a main character, maybe a secondary character, maybe a tertiary character won't play much, but a main character or a secondary character, it may be a protagonist or an antagonist, it is indifferent. All your characters will now have to become more self-aware because of the climax. The climax must show them which strengths they have to own and which weaknesses they have to own. The climax is meant to, again, reignite their goal, their motivation, or show them that they don't have enough motivation. Again, alignment between the character's goal through the interests of the character, the quirks of the character, and her relationships with other characters. Comprise her needs. Finally, when we get back to responsibility and who's caused which kind of harm, either intentionally or unintentionally, we'll want to establish now a scale of pain and a scale of hindrance. We want to establish this scale because we want, as per usual, provide some predictability. And we want to provide predictability because it creates engagement. We want to establish a pain scale because this scale will allow us to proportionate our reactions. This scale will allow us to display why the character's motivation is affected and which choices they're likely to take. Now, the fact of having a pain scale allows us also to determine a hindrance scale, because each kind of pain is caused through a different kind of hindrance. For example, if you start your scale, just as portrayed here, with insults, simple verbal attacks, you may consider that this is the lower layer. It is, in this scale at least, considered the lesser form of hindrance. And you'll want to proportionate this. You'll want to establish this scale maybe a little earlier, if you're not sure of your world's cohesion, if you're not sure of what's supposed to be consistent in your world and what's supposed to be coherent in your world. But really, the climax is the chapter which will need the skill. You will need the skill. Till this point, you didn't have the need for proportionating hindrance methods. Because your organizations, if they existed before chapter 6 or before chapter 5, they didn't have much decisions to take. They may have to regulate the daily life of your inhabitants. They may have to regulate the resources gathering and consumption, but they didn't have to, for example, imprison an individual or issue an order of arrest against an individual. So this skill will become crucial from now on. And it's why you want to make it two things. You want to make it progressive and you want to make it simple. Now, for example, here we only have 5 levels. Insult, assault, and by assault here we really mean battery, physical assault, torture, and torture here is broad. Note that each level is quite broad. There are no specificities here on the kind of insult. It's not an insult against a specific type of people. It's insult in general. Assault, same thing. It's not an assault with a specific orientation. Torture, again, it's not, for example, only sexual type of torture. It's torture in general. Betrayal, here again, it's not necessarily betrayal from a friend or betrayal from a family member or betrayal from a lover. It's every kind of betrayal. And murder, same thing. There's no specifics here. You just ended the life of another individual voluntarily. Because here, the murder, and we're separating just involuntary homicide and murder here. That's the only distinction. But here, murder, it englobes assassination, cannibalism. You have everything in this kind of work. And then you have the final skill. This skill will serve one main function: predicting the reaction of your characters and how it will affect their motivation. Now, when you've established this skill, you'll want to imagine, and you'll want to imagine it in every scene if you can, but in Crisis chapter it's much more important, and in the climax it's crucial. You want to imagine 3 kinds of reactions your character may have, and you may want to imagine also in the future 3 kinds of corresponding choices. For each reaction you imagine at least one choice that your character may have in this due situation. Now, you want to make this reaction a little unusual, maybe a little surprising, and it's up to you to decide what is supposed to be surprising. You want to keep the reaction a little familiar because it's still this character, but you want also to make the reaction a little different. The reaction has to be a reaction, so it has to surprise the character's entourage, her team, and even maybe the antagonist, because the reaction here may be creating some confusion to the antagonist. Because remember, it's the climax, it's the highest point in terms of pain. So if the protagonist does something that causes a lot of pain to the antagonist, that's just fine. That's the place where you want to do that. If the character hinders, if your main character, your protagonist hinders the antagonist and causes a lot of pain to her, that's the place, that's the chapter you want to do it. Because now, until chapter 9, chapter 7, 8, 9, if the character, the main character, the protagonist has hindered, has maybe destroyed the protagonist through her choices because she has decided that this choice was the most opportune, she will now have time to recover mentally because she has caused pain maybe to everyone else, including the antagonist. Now, the situation should reveal even more your character's motivation. You want to preserve a sense of coherence in her action, quality meta, and a sense of consistency in her action, quantity meta. And you want to balance coherence and consistency in order to preserve the character's motivation. Or you may want to display how the character has been incoherent or inconsistent since the beginning, and now you can show that her motivation wasn't that important after all. That's the two main ways you have. You want to reaffirm the character's motivation, or you want to invalidate the character's motivation. You have these two main ways. These are the two extremes. There's a scale of possibility in between those. Think of scales here. Pain scale, hindrance scale, reaction scale, motivation scale, and choices scale. Now the choices. We are supposed to reveal the character's true intention, the true intention of the antagonist, here either the threat or the menace, the protagonist's true intention, and the other secondary character that are part of the climax. These choices, and try to get at least 3 choices per character, at least for the main characters, will cause alignments shift. This is the moment where alignments change, where organizations may disappear, where new organizations may appear, or where the structure of existing organization may shift dramatically. A last note on pain. Pain is caused by the combination, the right mix of attachment and the will to react. So pain is caused by reaction for 50%. And those reactions are defined by the context. Now, if you want to make the reactions of your character surprising, it will be contextual. So in the context of the climax, in the context of the 6th chapter, you will find a way in the environment, in the character present, in the stakes, to make your character's reaction surprising. So revise the environment. What are the parts of the environment I can use to make the reaction surprising? Revise the characters. Which character is supposed to help your character, which character is supposed to hinder your character, and how your main character will act accordingly. Finally, in the stakes. Is the protagonist, for example, interested in the stakes at all? Because if she's not, she will have a definitely surprising reaction. Now, the aim of reaction, the aim of all this contextualization is to augment the predictability of the meta. And augmenting predictability here means developing a better ability to get more attachment out of your characters and the relationship between them and the public. And again, it will loop. Attachment will cause more reaction and more pain. And you have to recontextualize that to augment predictability and so on. Really, pain will be the proper balance between familiarity and surprise. Just like any other emotion in your story, just like in any scene of your story, you have to balance familiarity and surprise. Now for the menace. The menace is supposed, through crisis, to reinforce the threats. She will reinforce every threat, every antagonist, every group that may be opposing the protagonist. Before each crisis, whilst the protagonist is gathering resources, during the crisis, while the protagonist is facing a hindrance, and after the crisis, whilst the protagonist is trying to recover. The menace, and that's the defining feature here. The menace is different from the threat in that she is insidious. The menace will not reveal herself until chapter 6. In most cases. In most cases, the menace will want to preserve a high degree of secrecy. She will act in an indirect manner. And in some cases, in some story, you may want to write a Menace which is not a character at all. No, you want to present, especially if you're doing horror or comedy, you may want to create a nameless Menace, a Menace which is not one character, but which might be aligned with an organization. This Menace may only be the symbol of this organization represented in your story. Now, the Menace can be introduced early. The Menace can be introduced as early as chapter 1 and developed through chapter 1 to 5 before becoming prevalent in chapter 6. And the very fact that you can introduce the Menace early indicates you that this character can be introduced in another way than a Menace. This character can be introduced as a supporter. And that's one way you can take in terms of alignment shift. For a long time, the Menace can be a true supporter of your protagonist or your antagonist. And she can shift during chapter 6. During chapter 6, she can reverse decision process. She can decide that the protagonist, the antagonist, or both of them are absolutely useless to the development of the world and might need to be eliminated, or at least may not need to be supported anymore, because they're both, or at least one of them, hindrances. Now, the Menace should have surprising means of action and a surprising goal. Now, surprising again, all about the context of your story. It's all about the context of your story, and surprising here means she has to be a lot different from the other characters. That's it. So if your other characters are quite plain, it will not be difficult to create a surprising Menace. And that may be your story. You may want to have other plain characters and make, in the end, the Menace the most interesting character in your story. Most interesting than your protagonist, most interesting than your antagonist, most interesting than your other secondary character. Just as you can, present the Menace as a secondary character till a certain point in your story, and then make it cause a lot of damage. Your Menace may be hidden till the beginning of the story because she may be a secondary character or even a tertiary character if you want to do that. And then at some point, chapter 6 for example, she causes great trauma to every other character. That's one way to do it. Present a character which didn't seem to be so important with a goal which didn't seem to be so important, and in the end, and by the end here we mean really the middle ground of the story, so chapter 6, she causes a great deal of trauma. The Menace does not necessarily need to be presented with the same depth as the other antagonist. Now, the threat, for example, you want to present her origins to some degree. You don't need to present them as much as the protagonist again. So there's another scale here. You want to be as detailed as you can with the protagonist, maybe with her support. Then you want to be a little less detailed with the antagonist, if that's your choice again, because you can be as detailed as you need to be. And you want to be even less detailed or less specific with the origins of the Menace. Now, what is the bare minimum you'll need to present the Menace? Well, the minimum you need to present any character, and it's the minimum also for you to have a conversation with your character, is to present her needs and her wants. What does the Menace need, and what does the Menace want? Because this will push you through new questions. It will push her through new questions. But most importantly, these are the two essential questions in order to determine her goal. And her goal, again, just like for the protagonist, the antagonist, and the supporter, are determined by her quirks. The quirks are the visual part, really, of the goal of your character. They'll be determined by her interests, and they will be determined by her affinities and alignment. Now, the goal of the Menace will differ from the goal of the protagonist, which is pretty open. You know, the goal of your protagonist is the most open one. It will differ from the goal of your antagonist because the goal of your antagonist is often aligned on your protagonist, and it will differ from the goal of your supporter character because your supporters will either be aligned on your protagonist or your antagonist. The goal of the Menace is aligned on the world, and she wants to have a core influence on the world. She wants to create some significant change. Or she may not want to, but it may be caused by her. You know, it may go this way, even if her goal is not apparently significant. In order to pursue this goal, she will need help. She will need allies. Wherever she gathers them through her affinities, and by that we mean that maybe she has attacked them or they attacked her, they have some sort of conflictual relationship, you know, that helps to develop affinities a lot. Or she has gathered these allies through alignment, so they're in her depth. And wherever she has allies that she has gathered through affinities or alignment, they will need to be useful. No, they do not need to enjoy her, they do not need to appreciate her, but they need to be useful to her because she didn't choose them to be useless. Now, these allies can turn into friends or can turn into closer supporter if they share a high degree of affinity with the Menace. And they can turn into collaborators, close collaborators, if the goals of the Menace and this other character, this ally, align more. So think about the character's interests in terms of affinity, and think about the character's core goal in terms of alignment. Now for the threat. The threat is between the allies and the opponents. Because the protagonist, in most cases, the protagonist will be a clear opponent of the Menace. It will be the main opponent of the Menace. And there will be other organizations, because the Menace will create a lot of hindrances. She will cause a lot of harm around her. Again, it's not the goal of the Menace, it's just the repercussions. So organizations will oppose her, but which organizations? And which members inside these organizations? Because there may be already internal splits. So the protagonist opposes the Menace, and her supporters will oppose the Menace as well. But organizations, depending on their goal, depending on their responsibilities, depending on their prerogatives, will have to oppose the Menace. Now, why is the threat between opponents and allies? The threat may join the protagonist. The threat may join the Menace. So that's the upper arrow and the lower arrow. But there is a third one. The threat may become the Menace. If your Menace is not a character, if your Menace has no physical representation, the threat can turn into an entity which is even more dangerous and become the Menace herself. Now, all of that, and especially the third part, will all depend on the Menace's goals. Because if you've established early that the Menace goals will be directly aligned with the threat's goals, they are likely to become allies, or friends, or the same person. If you've established early that the goal of the Menace doesn't align with any other character, and which is likely because the goal of the Menace is supposed to be surprising and global, she may have a lot of opponents in the end. So you have these two extremes, these two antipodes, where the Menace can recruit the threat. The Menace can recruit a lot of people, in fact, because their goals are globals. Or the Menace can globally found a lot of opponents, and there's the whole scale for you to play with.